Good evening to everybody. I'm going to just stick around on this specific page for a couple of minutes or a minute or two. Take out your cell phones, take a picture of that specific QR code over there. The whole presentation will be there. You can get the full presentation, you can get our newsletters, and you can get everything and more information about the Efficient Group and all the subsidiaries of the Efficient Group right on that QR code. Just from my side, did give you a bit of a glimpse of what's been happening this afternoon. And it actually started about a week or two ago when we started preparing for the specific budget. It actually started longer than that before, because we keep up to date with most of the data I'm going to show you today. So it started some time ago, and we listened to the State of the Nation of the President. We picked a few things that the President mentioned in the State of the Nation address, because that usually gives you a bit of an indication of what can be expected in the budget. And then this morning, things really start getting wild. By this morning, we've already had a full presentation, all the framework of a full presentation. Thank you, Wilhelmine. Thank you very much, Wilhelmine, for that. And of course, everybody else that helped me with this. And by 2 o'clock, things really started picking up speed, because by 2 o'clock, there were a lot of individuals working together. And it is just amazing to see how people can work together. People that know their stuff, people that know the topic, the people that know what needs to be done. So thank you very much to Francois. Without him, he's here 10 years with me now. I can't believe that. Baie dankie, Francois. Eunice, natuurlijk, Chantay, Lazan, Alay, they were all there. Wilhelmine, everybody helped me. And Eunice, yeah, I've mentioned Eunice, the whole team were just absolutely amazing. And we put together this amazing presentation within a matter of about 3 hours or so. There's a lot of data in here. So again, take out your cell phone, take a picture of this QR code, and you will see there's a possibility. You can ask your question and answer block over there. Let's see if we can cover a couple of questions and answer a little bit later. I know it's not good manners to not show slides and or to show slides and not to talk through the slides, but we've got nearly 100 slides here, and it's impossible to go through all of them. So I will skip some of the slides, my apologies, but you can always send me an email later on of questions if you want to, and you will find the context if you go through the whole presentation in any event. So I will skip some of the slides because it's just going to be too many slides. Okay, let's get going. And the whole thing, let's get going with the presentation. So this is the contents of the presentation. We're going to start off with the State of the Nation by the President, because the whole thing is a unit, the State of the Nation and the budget and everything that goes with that. So let's just see if we can analyze and we can fact check a few of the numbers that the President mentioned in the State of the Nation. Then I will have a look at the global context, politically and economically, what's going on internationally, because that is starting to affect South Africa more and more. What's happening locally, and of course, there's an election around the corner. And then I'm going to get into the budget and really sink my teeth into the budget, touch on things like, for example, the economy, revenue, expenditure, the deficit, and some other announcements as well. So that's more or less what I tried to, that the plan for tonight, the presentation for tonight, and of course, ending with a couple of final impressions. Now, listening to this budget is about one thing only, and it is about politics. Remember the 29th of May, we will have our elections in South Africa. We know, and I will go through some of that now, that the ANC is on the back foot, and this is the last opportunity for the ANC to really try to convince people to vote for them again. And this is what this budget was all about. It was about politics. It was about the election. And the Minister of Finance, I think the President and the rest of the members of the cabinet should be very, very pleased with the performance of the Minister of Finance, because he really tried his utmost best to try to put, well, let's be honest, to put a bit of lipstick on a pig. So let's have a look at the State of the Nation and a couple of figures to see whether the President was actually correct in some of the numbers and some of the things that he said in the State of the Nation. He did tell us he's going to stabilize energy, that he's going to grow the economy, address poverty, fix logistics. We know that recently Transnet has been collapsing, address unemployment in South Africa, address the ports and the railways that are falling apart, address crime and corruption. The NHI is looking for his pen. The NHI is going to be signed. And of course, the COVID grant or SRD grant, the president did say it's going to be extended. Of course it is. It is going to be extended. What else did you think? Because there is an election around the corner, of course. But let's see if we can measure some of these numbers, if we can have a bit of an idea where South Africa fits in. It's all good and well in saying that we've been getting richer, but richer relative to what? Richer relative to ourselves, richer relative to the Chinese, or relative to what? So, and I think this picture gives us a good idea, this Human Development Index, on where South Africa finds itself compared to the rest of the world. And you can see South Africa is more or less a middle income country. We're not one of the poorest. North of us are countries that are much, much poorer than South Africa. If we look a little bit to the east, for example, India, on a per capita basis, is also a little bit poorer than South Africa. Not too long ago, China was poorer than South Africa. They've caught up with us, and they're certainly soon going to be much wealthier. In fact, they've already surpassed South Africa in terms of per capita GDP. So there you have it. South Africa is not a poor country, but South Africa is sort of middle of the road country in terms of human development. But now things are really starting to get interesting. This is South Africa's per capita GDP, adjusted for purchasing power parity and US dollar terms. And the solid line at 100%, that's the world. So how do we compare to the rest of the world? Well, this is a horrible figure. This is a horrible graph telling us that South Africa's per capita GDP deteriorated the past 10 years, and today our per capita GDP is about 3/4 of that of the average person internationally. So South Africa is getting poorer and poorer, and it really started turning around when it really started deteriorating in terms of per capita GDP around about 2008. Since then, it's only one direction, and that's for the average South African to be getting poorer and poorer by the year and by the day. This is a couple of things. Of course, we all know about electricity, and the president told us, he said it so many times before, that we're going to see the end of load shedding soon. Let's have a look at this graph. This is the red line in South Africa compared to the rest of the world, and that is South Africa's share population with access to electricity. Now, we were pretty much in line with the rest of the world, and around about 2015, South Africa started falling behind the rest of the world. We are still well ahead when you compare South Africa to the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa, for example. But if you look at the trend, you can see Sub-Saharan Africa keeps on going up, while South Africa has been stagnating recently. How much electricity do we generate? And this year, South Africa on a per capita basis will start generating less electricity than the rest of the world. South Africa has been generating more electricity compared to the rest of the world for many, many, many years. But this year, the world on a per capita basis will start generating more electricity than South Africa. This is this is the load shedding schedule of Eskom last year. And the red means more and more load shedding. While need I say much more, we can see that the load shedding has been increasing. I do not believe the president that we're going to see the end of load shedding soon. Looking at this trajectory, look at this trend, it's very clear to me that electricity, or a shortage of electricity, will become more of a fixed reality in South Africa going forward. This is a bit of a silver lining. It's a calculation that we have done. Basically, what it comes down to is that we are using electricity better in South Africa. For every 1 unit of electricity, we generate more GDP today. So in a way, what is happening, our productivity, electricity productivity improved. And in this process, just by the way, for the past 10 years, Eskom has lost about 10%, in fact, 30% of its market. The Eskom is becoming less relevant in terms of electricity provision in the South African economy. This graph pretty much tells you the same. South Africa is quite electricity and intense in its GDP generation, but gradually we're moving more to the average of the world, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because electricity was energy is scarce, energy is expensive, and we're working better with energy in South Africa. In the past, energy was quite cheap and it was easy to come by, and we did not always use electricity very well in the past. I'm not going to go through that. A couple of other issues that we have in South Africa, we all know about this one. This is South Africa's unemployment rate. We just received the most recent unemployment data this morning, and South Africa's unemployment data today is in excess of 32%. It is probably the highest in the world. The opposite of this is how many people of working age are actually employed in South Africa. And the answer is just over 38%, 39% of people of working age, people that should, well, can potentially work less than 39%. Less than 40% of people that can work in South Africa that are of working age are actually employed in South Africa. It is the opposite or the mirror image of this one, and that is the unemployment levels in South Africa. So this is the people that can work, and of people that can work in South Africa, less than 40% of them are actually working. Another number that the president alluded to, and it's life expectancy in South Africa. Life expectancy is below that, and the red line again is South Africa, and our life expectancy is above the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa. Recently, there was a turnaround in life expectancy, and I've got a suspicion that the COVID pandemic recently probably contributed to that as well. Here, this is a very interesting graph. The red line again is South Africa, and you can see South Africans are quite avid users of the internet. And more, if you compare South Africa's users of the internet, we are better users of the internet than the world average. And I've got a suspicion of that this may have to do with electricity. So electricity goes off, and what do? We all grab our cell phones and jump on the internet to see what is going on, because that's the only thing that still work with the battery. So whenever electricity goes off, we start using our cell phones. Average year of schooling, of course, education or skills development is very dear to me. And I was actually surprised, and I'm very happy to see that on average, South Africans go to school for longer than most people in the world. So we send our kids to school for quite a number of years, more than the average in the rest of the world. If you compare South Africa's literacy rates, you will also find that South Africa's literacy rate on average is slightly better than that of the rest of the world, much better than Sub-Saharan Africa as well. But, and this is the real major issue in South Africa. So we send our kids to school for quite a number of years. The kids can read and write at a fairly, well, I guess they're literate. But the problem is the quality of our education in South Africa is not good. In fact, it's very bad. This is the TIM study and the Pearl study, which compares South Africa's grade 4s and grade 8s, for example. And you will see South Africa is the bottom of most countries there, and quite often South Africa is stone last. So we send our kids to school, but the quality of education in South Africa is just not good enough, especially when it comes to mathematics. This is what we think about corruption in South Africa. Where if it goes down, it's a bad thing. And the perception of corruption today, and this isn't something else that I'm very concerned about, is actually worse than during the Zuma years. So corruption perception in South Africa is currently the lowest it has ever been. We all know about South Africa's crime, and this graph clearly illustrates what's going on with crime in South Africa. It is exceptionally high, and in recent years, we've seen an increase in violent crime in South Africa as well. Okay, that is the SONA, to analyze the SONA. My conclusion is that the president is a little bit taking a few chances here if he reckons that things have been going better in South Africa. I think all in all, in most cases, South Africa is deteriorating compared to the rest of the world. And in many cases, although we're still well ahead of, say, Sub-Saharan Africa, the poorest region in the world, even Sub-Saharan Africa is catching up with South Africa. Okay, so that's my verdict on the SONA. I think the president is taking a few chances there. So let's go see what's going on in the rest of the world. Just a few comments of what's going on in the rest of the world. The war in Ukraine, that is still going on. It's probably going to go on for a long time, except if Donald Trump is elected president in the United States, and it seems as if that is going to be the case. I think Donald Trump will put a lot of pressure on Zelensky to make some sort of deal with the Russians and lose a significant chunk of territory of Ukraine. That is probably what's going to happen there. And of course, South Africa is positioning ourselves in a certain manner there, and Americans do not like this. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later. But South Africa's positioning here is not good. And I'm going to show you a little bit later why I say so. China is becoming more authoritarian, and tension around Taiwan has escalated in recent years. The Indian economy, although the Indians are behind South Africa on a per capita basis, as an example, but the Indian economy is cooking. Of all the big economies, I've got my money on the Indian economy. I think that is going to be the new rising star globally. Latin America is very interesting. They swang to the left in Brazil, and they swang to the right in Argentina. So let's see what this anarcho-capitalist Malay is going to do in Argentina. I'm actually quite interested to see about that economic experiment going on there. And then now what we have is the war in the Middle East. And again, South Africa is positioning themselves in a certain manner. And I think South Africa is, again, not realizing what the potential damage that can do to the South African economy. I'm not taking a political position here. I'm taking an economic position here, and positioning yourself politically in a certain manner can potentially have certain financial and economic implications, and I will get to that a little bit later. On the economic front, globally, inflation seems to be drifting lower. Interest rates seem to be coming lower as well. Not everywhere, but most of the larger economies in the world will probably, especially the Americans, are likely to start cutting interest rates. Most of Europe at the moment is in a recession. The Chinese economy is really struggling. The US economy just keeps on powering ahead. Everybody thinks that the US economy should have been in a recession, or most economists predicted a recession by now, but that's just not happening. The US economy is really a miracle economy, doing very, very well. And then because of South Africa's political, or our positioning, I wonder whether we're going to see, especially the Americans perhaps, punishing South Africa later this year. This is just a table on a couple of macroeconomic estimates on some variables. I just want to touch on a few. Global economic growth estimated to be about 2.5% for this year. Chinese economic growth 4.5%. I think that's too quick. I think Chinese economic growth is likely to be slower. US economic growth is set at 1.6%. I think it could be stronger. Global inflation just below 6%, and US inflation just below 3%. That is important because that will determine on whether how much the Americans are going to cut interest rates, and we pretty much follow the Americans when it comes to interest rates. Okay, let's have a look at what's going on in South Africa. And let's have a look at what's going on in the elections and what can be expected in the elections. And this will all tie up very nicely with the budget a little bit just after this. We have to understand all of this because the whole thing is a unit. First, before I get to what I expect on a national level, just a few comments about the provinces. I think we're going to see coalitions, especially in Gauteng, and we're going to see probably coalitions in KZN as well, and maybe some of the other provinces. And whatever happens on provincial level will have an impact on national level as well. And also, that's one thing that's important. Secondly, if the ANC loses a lot of support, chances are quite good that the president will also lose support, and the president might not be returned as the president of South Africa. Keep that in mind as well. I think in the case of Gauteng, there's a good possibility that the Gauteng government could form a coalition with the EFF, because the Gauteng leadership of the ANC is quite close to the EFF. But that means that the EFF will have certain demands on national level as well. And pretty much the same sort of scenario in KZN, where the ANC could form a coalition with MK, the new, very surprisingly strong new political party, MK. Some scenarios, and I think there are two scenarios here, a bad scenario and a worse scenario. If the ANC gets between 45 and 55%, which is the most likely scenario, the ANC will be in charge for another 5 years in South Africa. It will continue with their misrule. They will be able to form a coalition with the smaller political parties. If the ANC gets less than 45%, that's a worse scenario, and that means that the ANC will have to form a coalition with either the DA, the EFF, or the newly formed MK party. And this is my call. I think what we're going to see is an ANC, MK coalition and KZN, and I also believe we're going to see an ANC, MK coalition on a national level. So what does it mean? Well, pick any two of these names, what's it, 7 names that I've got on the slide. I think chances are quite good that the president will not be re-elected as president of South Africa, but he could be. So he certainly is one of his head, or his name is in the hat. But here are some other names: Paul Mashatile, Gwede Mantashe, Fikile Mbalula, nogal. Frikkie, he's also known as Frikkie Mbalula, Ronald Lamola, and I must say I really like him. I think he's, of all the senior members in the ANC, he's probably the best. Unfortunately, he does not have a very strong constituency, so he's probably not going to be elected, but I really hope that Ronald Lamola will be at least a deputy. I'm not holding my breath. And then, of course, Julius Malema and the current leader of the MK party, Kanyehile, he could demand the deputy position if the ANC and the MK party forms a coalition on national level. My guess is that our next president is going to be Paul Mashatile, and our next deputy president is going to be Kanyehile after the elections on March 29th. some local context, and I just want to touch on this because I'm going to get to the budget now, and this is important to understand that. So we have a new government after the 29th of May, and they have certain challenges, and they have three challenges. The three challenges are local authorities. The local authorities are in very deep trouble. The state-owned enterprises, we're going to talk about that a little bit. And the national accounts. The national accounts are in deep, deep trouble, and I'm going to talk about that as well. I just want to make an important point here. When you analyze the fiscal accounts and the state-owned enterprises and local authorities, these are very different entities. They've got their own financials. They stand on their own financial feet. They've got their own revenue sources, and they spend their money, and they're supposed to be financially viable, all of them. And that's why they are seen as separate levels of government. In recent years, the local authorities and the SOEs collapsed to such an extent that we can't really separate these various authorities anymore, because the local authorities and the SOEs have become, in many cases, totally dependent on the Minister of Finance. I'm going to show you some of these numbers. So the correct way of analyzing the fiscal accounts is to put a whole lot of them together and to see if you can calculate things like deficits and debt levels and so on. So I think we need to change the way that we're looking at our fiscal accounts, and it needs to be included, the state-owned enterprises and the local authorities. Now, here are just some numbers. I'm not going to go through all the numbers. It's going to take too long. But the state-owned enterprises are in very deep trouble. This is the land bank. Just a couple of highlights or lowlights on what's been happening on our land bank. Eskom, they're making losses again. Eskom has been getting many, many billions of rands recently. They got huge increases in electricity prices, but still they're making losses. Outstanding debt of hundreds of billions of rands. South African Airways, they made another loss. Now, if there's one person that I blame for this, it's Pravin Gordhan. I'm going to share some slides a little bit later. The one single minister of finance, or the one single minister that probably caused more damage to the South African economy than anybody else is Pravin Gordhan. And one of his, and so I think South African Airways is just one example of that, but there are many other examples of that. Transnet recently has been collapsing more and more so, and of course that's got a huge impact on logistics in South Africa, and indirectly, of course, a huge impact on South Africa's economic growth. The post office is coming to an end. It is just disappearing. It is just stopping. The post office. There was nothing for the post office in the budget, just by the way. The NEL, another of those state enterprises. Electricity demand, we just do not have enough electricity. I showed you the numbers. Road network, 200 billion behind in backlog in infrastructure investments, what we need. PRASA, Transnet, the ports, the water sanitation, the list goes on and the list goes on and the list goes on. This is just a table up to 21, 22, and it does that excludes another 100 billion or so of some of the state-owned enterprises and how much money they've been getting the last couple of years and so on. So you can look, for example, at South African Airways, that's nearly 50 billion rand, and they're going to get another billion now. So it's 50 billion rand on South African Airways that they've received, and they've had 10 turnaround plans, and we're still pumping money into South African Airways, and they're still not flying. So that's the kind of management that we have. The local authorities, the outstanding debt of the local authorities is probably in the region of about 60, 70 billion rand at the moment. That's mostly what they own to Eskom. And the interesting thing is, the Minister of Finance said, I will assist the local authorities provided they do A, B, and C, and amongst others, they have to reduce their outstanding debt to Eskom. But every month, this keeps on going up. And that's why I say the local authorities, the finances of these local authorities, mismanaged local authorities, should actually be included in the national accounts of the Minister of Finance, because that is where the buck stops in the end. A couple of other challenges that we are all aware of. Unemployment, I did mention that. A number of protests. This is a good thing. And I'm actually quite surprised to see in recent months, we've seen a reduction in number of protests in South Africa. Let's hope it remains fairly quiet until the election. But we've got relatively high levels of protests, but recently there's been a bit of a lull when it comes to protests, which is a good thing. The hotspots where the protests are happening, this is an interesting one. I spoke to a political analyst last night, and he mentioned something. If you look at the hotspots, where the hotspots are, and you look at the spots where the new MK party are doing in some of these recent elections, where the MK party is doing well, there's quite a significant overlap here. And he made the comment, the MK party, which is seen as the Zuma party, that is also where We had the protests 2 years ago. So could there be a link? It certainly looks like it. Okay, crime in South Africa. I'm not going to go through all of that, but that's a major challenge, and South Africa's got major challenge as far as crime is concerned. All right, the South African gravy train has derailed. Let's have a look at the budget and a few things that was announced by the budget of the Minister of Finance. Now, what is the context? What's the fiscal setting in which this budget has been presented? First of all, the economy is stagnating. The economy is stagnating simply means that you cannot take or tax the economy too much because the economy simply cannot carry this tax burden anymore. We have been seeing recent tax increases. So the tax burden has been increasing, but we've reached a limit. We've reached a limit on how far we can tax South Africans further. And I'm going to analyze that a little bit later, a little bit more. So we can't really increase taxes because the economy simply cannot bear this anymore. And on top of all of that, the tax base in South Africa is exceptionally narrow. So very few people pay just about all the taxes in the country, and I'm going to show you some of that as well. There are a huge increase in demand on the fiscus, and something that really concerns me is that the president is proud of an increase in poverty in South Africa because he tells us how proud he is about more and more people getting grants from the state. And poor people get grants from the state. How on earth can the president see that as some sort of achievement? But there's a huge increase in demands, all sort of social demands on the state. And we've got very high levels of dis-saving by the state. That's capital distraction. Put differently, when the state borrows long-term money and they spend it on short-term current expenditure, you destroy capital. That's what the state is doing. The state-owned enterprises are collapsing. I've showed you that already. The debt trajectory is unsustainable. There's some tricks here and there, and I'll get to that. And I also, like I've mentioned earlier, I believe that we need to amend, we need to change the way that we report fiscal accounts. Because the fiscal accounts cannot, as always, and I'm going to do this tonight as well, I'm not going to look mostly at the national accounts, but what we need to do, we actually have to include the state-owned enterprises and the local authorities in that as well, because they've become so dependent on the fiscus for funding as well. And the dotted line, by the way, is an estimate going forward. And you will always see, looking at estimates by the Minister of Finance, and this is the estimate of the Minister of Finance, that things will look better in future. He's a real economist. Economists always predict the future to be better. The Minister of Finance also. He says, listen, I'm going to spend less, but not yet. From next year onwards, I will spend less. And that's the dotted line for going forward, Minister of Finance. This is his estimates. Actual numbers up to the dotted line, and then the estimates of the Minister of Finance. And we can see over the years, state expenditure has been going up, and it's likely to keep on going up. And I'm going to show you where state expenditure is going up and where it has been going up in recent years. While on the revenue side, I did mention that the economy is overtaxed already. The economy cannot carry that tax burden anymore. And we can actually see that despite some recent tax increases in recent years, the tax to GDP ratio remains relatively flat. So what is happening, we increase tax rates, but we don't get in much more money because the economy simply cannot carry this kind of burden, and many taxpayers are simply immigrating out of the country. This is a slide by the Minister of Finance. I'm not going to go through all of this. I just want to touch on one or two things. If you go down on the right-hand, on the left-hand side, you will see there's an item called budget balance, the budget balance. And the budget balance is the fiscal deficit. It's the difference between how much they spend and how much they get in. In other words, basically the amount of money that they're going to borrow. And go to the year 23-24, and you will see that the fiscal deficit there was minus 4.9% to GDP, which is, of course, significantly higher than what the Minister of Finance originally budgeted for. The next year, starting in the 1st of April, the Minister of Finance is budgeting for a fiscal deficit of 4.5%. I just want to make a comment about that specific number. If the economy is growing at, say, 1%, and you're running a fiscal deficit of 4%, 5%, whatever the case might be, then your fiscal stance is highly expansionary. The Minister of Finance borrows a lot of money and he pumps that into the economy, and the fiscus is expansionary. It supports demand in the economy. And of course, the price that you pay for that is that you accumulate more and more debt. You can't do it indefinitely, but it's an expansionary fiscal stance, a large fiscal deficit that what we are currently running. And then the Minister of Finance tells us from 25-26, the fiscal deficit will start coming down to below 4% and even lower in the year 26-27. Now, if you compare this table to previous budgets, it always looks more or less the same. This year is going to be bad, next year a little bit better, but then things are going to start looking much, much better. And I do not believe that the Minister of Finance, these estimates will be achieved because like previous years, especially in recent years, they could not achieve these kind of estimates. All right, the economy, a few things on the economy, a few estimates on the economy. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them. I just want to touch on 3 specific numbers, the 3 at the bottom. And that's the estimates for economic growth 24, 25, 26, inflation, and also the current account deficit. The economic growth, this is the minister's estimates. He expects economic growth for the year 24 at 1.3%. I think the minister is far too optimistic. I don't see the economy growing faster than 1%. I think it will be less than 1%. Economic growth in 23, we're waiting for the final numbers, is probably going to be 0.6% or so. For the year thereafter, the minister expects 1.6 and then 1.8%. Can you see the trajectory here? And that's typical what economists and politicians do. They always tell us it will get better. It will always get better. But even if we do grow the economy at 2%, that's not nearly enough to do something about poverty and unemployment. Inflation numbers, I agree with the minister more or less. I'm a little bit concerned about the possible financial crisis in South Africa, and then inflation numbers will look completely different. But inflation between 4 and 5%, I am happy with that. I can agree with that at the moment as things stand at the moment. The current account deficit, that's basically the difference between South Africa's imports and our exports. Now that is getting, and I agree with the minister again on those numbers, but that is getting a little bit concerned about because that means we're importing more than what we are exporting, which means we need capital inflows to fund those additional imports that we are doing at the moment. We do not export enough, basically, or put differently, we live above our means in South Africa, making us more dependent on foreign capital inflow. So if you run a current account deficit, and you find that capital flows out of your economy for whatever reason, then your currency is going to take a major knock. So a current account deficit is a problem especially when you have a vulnerable currency like what we have in South Africa. Okay, economic growth, these are the actual numbers, the blue ones, and then the estimates of the Minister of Finance again. And you can see the Minister of Finance's estimates is about 1.5% for the next 3 years or so. You can see that what happened in the years 20 and 21, for example, those were the years of the COVID years. We had a deep recession during the lockdown, and the year thereafter was a huge increase in economic activity. So that's an unusual kind of numbers that we saw there. More importantly, is just look at the most recent 2 years, and you will see economic growth was 1.9% and 0.6% last year, and now probably around about, the minister expects for this year economic growth of 1.3%, which I don't think will materialize. Interest rates, the repo rate in South Africa currently 8.25%. I think there is space for the Reserve Bank to start cutting interest rates. We're probably going to wait until June, July, somewhere there before they start cutting rates. With a bit of luck, with inflation remaining relatively low, we could see the Reserve Bank cutting by 75, maybe 100 basis points or so. But that will really depend on things like, for example, the exchange rate of the currency and other factors as well, like, for example, the international oil price. On the revenue side, so this graph just gives us an indication of where South Africa in terms of the tax burden where we are, and you can see South Africa in terms of the tax burden, the darker the green, the higher the tax burden on that specific economy. The Europeans are highly taxed. For example, you can see that. I was quite surprised to see Brazil is also a relatively highly taxed country. The Canadians are also relatively highly taxed. South Africa is sort of in the middle of the road. Sub-Saharan Africa, the tax burden Sub-Saharan Africa is significantly lower than South Africa. And other places like, for example, the tax burden in places like India is also lower than South Africa. So the point is South Africa, in terms of the tax burden, is sort of in the middle of the road. Remember, the efficiency of state spending also matters here. I'm just looking at the revenue side, the tax burden of the specific economy. So who's doing all the paying? This is the personal income taxes. On the left-hand side, we have the number of taxpayers in South Africa. You will see on the top there, we have a number of taxpayers, which is 1.4% of the number of taxpayers in South Africa. And of that, 1.4% are responsible for 32% of all the personal income taxes paid in South Africa. We're talking about a number of individuals, 200,000 individuals in South Africa. Only 200,000 individuals pay about a third of all personal income taxes. And personal income taxes are by far the most important single tax to the Minister of Finance. We have a look at company taxes. Company taxes, we have a number of companies, 770 companies paying two-thirds. Less than 1,000 companies paying two-thirds of all company taxes in South Africa. I want to make a comment here that South African fiscus is the most redistributive fiscus in the world. Few people do most of the paying, and a lot of people do most of the receiving side. So it's highly redistributive. In fact, the minister, when he started his speech today, he spoke about the pie. And he said the economists try to increase the size of the pie, and the job of politicians is to redistribute the pie. So they are very, very good at redistributing the pie. They are not very good at getting the pie bigger. In fact, and quite often the pie is getting smaller in South Africa. I'm not going to spend too much money on this. I just want to make the point is that South Africa is paying huge amounts of money. In the current financial year, we will pay 90 billion rand to the customs union countries around us. And if you do a proper analysis, you will find that they are really, this is an excellent deal for the custom union countries around South Africa. That's Namibia, Lesotho, Swaziland, Botswana. Those are, and of course, South Africa is also part of the customs union. But the other countries really benefit hugely from the custom union payments. And South Africa fiscal accounts being in trouble, maybe we should revisit the specific custom union payment. So some announcements in terms of taxes, no announcements on personal income taxes, but the Minister of Finance did not adjust personal income taxes, but by doing nothing, the Minister of Finance actually increased personal income taxes because of the effect of fiscal drag or bracket creep. So bracket creep, with a bit of inflation, you will end up in a high income tax bracket and your taxes will actually go up. And a total increase in taxes, personal income taxes, without doing anything, the Minister of Finance actually increased personal income taxes by 16.1 billion rand. There were some adjustments on some sin taxes, that's on cigarettes and so on, more or less in line with the inflation. No increase for the fuel leave and the road accident fund, and that was actually a bit of a surprise to me. I thought he's going to increase that again. The minister did announce that he will introduce a global minimum tax, corporate tax at 15%. 15% for, it doesn't matter where you generate your income from. If you do business anywhere in South Africa, you will have to pay at least an effective tax rate of 15%. And that will become effective in 2 years' time. And the Minister of Finance reckons that he can collect about 8 billion rand extra from that. I'm against this. What we need to do, we need to reduce corporate taxes in South Africa. Because that's how we attract capital. That's how you get companies to do business in your country. Here's another one. A rebate for electricity, electric car manufacturers of 150% of capital. Now, this is a huge incentive for local producers to start manufacturing electric vehicles in South Africa. The fiscal deficit then was announced, I did mention, at 4.9% of GDP. Where's the money coming from? The most important revenue source for 36% is personal income taxes, followed by value-added tax about a quarter, and corporate tax about 15%, and then a number of other smaller taxes make up the rest of the revenue of the Minister of Finance. Remember, on that QR code that you took a picture of, you will get this information. You can go through that at your own time while having a nice beer. All right, I did mention no adjustments on personal income taxes. Oh, the medical tax credits were also not increased with inflation, and effectively that means an increase in the revenue of about 2 billion rand to the Minister of Finance. In the current financial year, tax revenue is under pressure. The Minister of Finance, the total revenue seems to be about 50-60 billion below the original budgeted estimates. I did mention that one, and then I did mention that one as well. All right, this is an interesting calculation. Francois did this quickly this afternoon. The red line is debt servicing costs. That's interest on state debt. And this year, interest on state debt will be higher than, let's call it, social protection services. Social protection services include things like, for example, the various grants and housing and so on. So we pay more on interest this year than what we're going to pay on social protection in the economy. So where's the money going to? The biggest expense item is education, 20%, 16% social protection, and 16% to the debt service cost. You can see the two now. Debt service costs will surpass social protection this year for the first time. So how many people getting grants in South Africa? Quite a lot, nearly 30 million people. That's the red line, roughly. Number of people grant recipients in South Africa. And the blue line are the number of people with actual jobs in South Africa. And you will see that the dependency ratio in South Africa at the moment is nearly 2. So for every person that receive a grant from the state, there are, for every 2 people that receive a grant from the state, there's 1 person that's got an actual job in the economy. This is unsustainable. This, again, I did mention South Africa is the most redistributed fiscus in the world, and we can see why. Because few people work, and the people that do work, they pay huge amounts of taxes in order to keep other people alive. I'm not necessarily against this. The point I want to make, the economy is not growing fast enough to employ enough people, and the economy is not growing fast enough because of the wrong macroeconomic policies and the wrong ideologies and stuff like that. Some other expenditure announcements, salary bill to increase more or less in line with inflation, which is too high because civil servants, not all of them, but civil servants in South Africa are very well remunerated, and we just cannot afford many thousands of civil servants that get in excess of R1 million pay annually from the state. We have civil servants are overpaid in South Africa, and quite often they are underworked as well. The grants to increase by CPI, also excluding the so-called COVID grant, that is not to be increased this time around, but the SRD or the COVID grant will be improved in April. What that means, I'm not 100% sure, but I've got a suspicion that means that we are probably heading for something like maybe a basic income grant, or maybe a consolidation of the various grants. And I think in April, there could be a bit of an increase in the SRD grant, but maybe there will be some changes in the whole structure of the social support network that we have in South Africa. A couple of other numbers. This is important. We need a fiscal anchor. A fiscal anchor means that what can you do? What is it what you try to achieve? What is the sort of what you want to aim, what you want to achieve in terms of fiscal accounts? And the minister did mention that he wants the primary budget surplus to be the fiscal anchor. Basically, what it comes down to, if you exclude interest, we must run a fiscal surplus all the time. So that is basically the fiscal anchor that the Minister of Finance is proposing. It's not a bad idea, but as always, you have to achieve that. The deficit, we did mention the deficit and the debt. Yeah, I'm going to get to that. You will, if you followed this presentation last year, you will see that I did say that the debt will soon reach 80% of GDP. Now, all of a sudden, this debt is much, much lower in the estimates of the Minister of Finance, and there's a very good reason for that. I'll get to that. This is actually very interesting. Before I get to that, I just want to make this important point. Who lends money to the state? Who are the lenders of money? Who buys state debt instruments? And here they are. At the bottom are the non-residents. The light blue one are the non-residents. The orange one just above that are the banks. And then a little bit further up, you will get the other blue one. There's other financial institutions. Those are typically the savings industry, unit trust, and so on. So, but the point I want to make, you will find that the bottom one, the non-residents, foreigners, are selling state debt, and the guys that are currently buying state debt are the banks, the local banks, and other financial institutions. And this is important because I'm going to get to a scenario a little bit later. Keep this in the back of your mind. Some other things, you can see this also, let me see on the right-hand side, that this is the non-residents on the right-hand side. Their holding of state debt has been falling in the recent years, while local investors overall have been buying more local state debt. So foreigners, and those foreigners, by the way, are mostly Europeans and Americans, they are selling state debt, while the local guys are buying more state debt. If you look at the left-hand slide, this is on an index basis, just by the way. The gray slide, or the gray graph, you will see that is government bond holdings by the total government bond holdings, and the red one is how many of those bonds are held by the banking industry. And again, the banks are holding more of government bonds, and a little bit later I'll get to that as well. Just for fun, a couple of numbers. Interest payments per year, about 200 billion. That's the interest that the Minister of Finance pays per year. Interest payment per second, 6,000 rand per second. 80,000 rand, that is a per capita debt of every individual inside. You owe, each one of you owe 80,000 rand more than what you think. This is state debt as a percentage of GDP, and under the various presidents. Look at the Zuma years, things really got out of hand. And of course, it continued to get out. The debt levels keep on increasing even under Ramaphosa as well. This is just debt as a percentage of GDP. And when the debt keeps on going up, you become downgraded. This is our downgrades. We've had a number of downgrades, and currently we are graded as so-called junk bonds in South Africa. Chances are we're not going to get out of that for a very long time. This is so that this saving of the state, basically the calculation is how much money do they borrow, and how much money of the money that they've borrowed do they spend on current expenditure? And currently that number is approximately 2% of GDP. So the state effectively destroys the capital to the tune of equal to about 2% to GDP. Now, here's the interesting one. Let me just explain this. There's something at the South African Reserve Bank. It's called the Gold and Foreign Exchange Contingency Reserve Account. It is basically a reserve account that is linked to the reserves held at the South African Reserve Bank, and those reserves consist of gold and other reserves like, for example, euros and dollars and yens and so on. So the reserve account at the Reserve Bank currently has an unrealized profit of 507 billion rand. So what happened is the Reserve Bank will buy, example, a dollar for 10 rand. The rand will weaken to, say, for example, 20 rand, and the Reserve Bank will make an unrealized profit of about 10 rand in my example. Now, the unrealized profit have accumulated now to about 507 billion rand at the South African Reserve Bank. Of course, if the opposite happens, then the balance or the unrealized profits will start falling. But in theory, this money actually belongs to the state. Of course, the state can't take all of it all of a sudden because you need a bit of a buffer. But in theory, this money is money that belongs to the state. And in any event, if the Reserve Bank makes money, that extra profits at the Reserve Bank are always transferred to the state in any event. And this is the Minister of Finance. This is something that really saved him. And it saved the ANC to an extent because this 507 billion rand lying at the South African Reserve Bank is something that you simply cannot let lie, especially with an election around the corner. So they've decided to take 100 billion rand of that. And 100 billion rand of that will be transferred to the Minister of Finance, and he will use this to reduce debt. Of course, he's not going to use it to reduce debt. In fact, there are some expense items, certain categories of civil servants' salaries that already are going up, like nurses and teachers and so on. But the theory is that he's supposed to use this to pay off state debt. So of that 507 billion, 100 billion will be transferred to the Minister of Finance. Then into 2 subsequent years, another 25 billion will be transferred to the Minister of Finance as well. But, and the savings, the interest saving, because of the reduction in state debt, will be approximately 30 billion rand. Now, all of that is all good and well, and I don't have a problem with that. But remember, if the Minister of Finance spends money in the economy, then the Reserve Bank needs to drain this liquidity, needs to mop up this extra liquidity, and that costs money. And that costs money to the South African Reserve Bank. Because the Reserve Bank will take them, will basically buy cash from the banks and pay the banks at the repo rate. That's basically how the Reserve Bank will drain some of this liquidity in order to achieve its monetary policy targets. And the Reserve Bank will make a loss. And for that reason, the Minister of Finance said, but the Reserve Bank, you can take another 100 billion of this 507 billion, and you can use that for the cost of implementing monetary policy because of this transfer of 150 billion that I'm going to spend over the next 3 years because of this. All right. And that means of this 500 billion, 250 billion is already gone. Now, the remaining 250, you can use that as well, but now you start taking a bit of a risk here. Because if there's something going on in the financial markets and there's some hiccup in the financial markets, you need a bit of a buffer somewhere. I guess they can take another 50 or maybe even another 100 billion from that. But they've already used, in one swipe, they've already used half of the 500 billion rand that lies at reserve at the South African Reserve Bank, and what is left now will be, in 3 years' time, will be only 250 billion rand, depending how the exchange rate of the currency which changes over the next couple of years. I'm not necessarily against that again. Normal practice is for central banks to transfer this to the fiscal accounts in any event. This is a huge amount of money that was transferred in one shot. This money is the reason, this is the reason why the debt levels are now lower than what we previously thought. This is why the fiscal account is going to look much better than what it underlying really, really is. So all of a sudden, many of the fiscal account numbers, many of the fiscal numbers look much, much better, while the underlying trends are still for increasing debt and increasing debt levels. Okay, I did mention those. Let me see. No extra money for Transnet, but Transnet did get some 50 billion in December already. Transnet was hit over the knuckles because they did not privatize the Eskom's financing corporation, and there was a penalty of 4 billion. That's just a bit of fun. I'm not going to show you this. A couple of final impressions. This budget was all about the election. There's no doubt about it. There was really a big luck for the ANC in that they could dip into the golden foreign exchange contingency reserve account. And spend an additional, get basically for nothing, 100 billion rand. That is a huge amount of money. I believe, and I look at the estimates of the Minister of Finance, that the Minister of Finance is probably too optimistic when it comes to his economic estimates going forward. Things like economic growth and fiscal deficits and so on. And we're certainly not out of the woods. Although it's going to look better, the debt numbers as an example, the underlying trajectories simply point to our unsustainable fiscal accounts over time. Then a couple of things that I'm getting a bit concerned about, and I did mention this a little bit earlier. Here is a possible scenario. South Africa is aligning ourselves politically, or positioning ourselves politically in a certain manner. We know that the Americans are reviewing their relationship with South Africa. That could mean that, for example, that we could be excluded from AGOA. It could mean, like what we've already seen in recent years. Last year, we lost 100 billion rand, for example, in foreign investments in South Africa, that foreigners will continue to sell South African bonds. If they keep on selling South African bonds, or if the Americans review their relationship with us, especially if Trump comes back as president, then if we keep on this, the rand will bomb out one day. When we get to that point, I don't know where it is, but the rand will suddenly weaken if foreigners sell more bonds and take the money out. That will lead to higher short-term, long-term interest rates, and it will lead to a weaker currency as well. That means that the locals must start buying these bonds because somebody must buy it. Of course, then much, much higher yields. And the banks will be some of those buyers. In fact, the South African Reserve Bank already indicated that they're getting concerned about how much debt of the state the banks are taking on their own balance sheets. The inflation rate will go up sharply, and depending who's the governor at the South African Reserve Bank, short-term interest rates will go up sharply as well, and GDP economic growth will come under tremendous pressure. Now, this is the barometer. This is the thing that tells us what foreigners think of South Africa. We've updated this afternoon, and this is basically a graph or a barometer telling us whether the exchange rate of the currency the rand is correctly priced. Currently, the rand is priced at around about 19 rand to the US dollar. And you can see it's on the right-hand side. That is very expensive. Or put differently, the rand is hugely undervalued. The rand should trade at better than 17 to the US dollar. Now, I can explain to you how we do this specific calculation, but the rand is usually undervalued. The rand is usually in that blue part somewhere. Currently, the rand is completely out of line. And that's an indication that foreigners are getting concerned about South Africa. Again, this is the QR code. Please take out your phone, take a picture of this QR code. Everything will happen automatically. And you will get this presentation. You're more than welcome to send me questions if you want to. Send me an email, whatever the case might be. And I will try to answer that as best as I possibly can. There are some questions here. And let me see if I can go. You're welcome to post some questions here. Just put the Q&A there and post questions. Let me see if I can go through some of the questions. I could not see anything. Will you do the questions? Mm-hmm. Okay. Francois?
I'll just read them for you. So the first one is from Louis Creer. Without inclusive economic development and progress, social advancement for the majority of the population is not sustainable. How sustainable are social grants? That's his first question.
Okay, yes. Without inclusive economic growth, we are not going to make progress as a country. But I can promise you, where we are now, with very weak economic growth, we're certainly not going to make progress in any event. If you're going to be poor, it's better to be poor in a rich country than to be poor in a poor country. And even if we don't have so-called inclusive economic growth, if we have exclusive economic growth, where only a few people get very wealthy, those few people will pay a lot of taxes, and you can use those taxes at least to uplift the poor as well. But yes, we want everybody to participate and get the benefits from stronger economic growth. And if you want to achieve that, you have to do the following. You have to make sure we have electricity. You have to make sure that we have a safe environment. You have to make sure that we have proper infrastructure. You have to make sure that people don't die of cholera. You have to make sure that their health services work properly. You have to make sure that people got good and proper quality skills development, as an example. Those are the kind of things that you need to do if you want everybody to participate in a growing economy. And I'm afraid we don't have that.
Another good question, I think, from Louis. Louis, on a scale from 0 to 10, what do you think is the probability of a collaboration between the current ruling party or whoever will be next and constructively working with the business sector to stimulate economic development?
Yeah, so the question is that what political party will be the best coalition partner for the ANC? Because the ANC is probably going to be in government again. So if you want to have a business-friendly government going forward, what is the best opposition party to go into coalition with? I think there are three possible coalition partners. Of course, there are a couple of smaller ones. Let's exclude smaller ones, but there are three major ones. The three major ones are the DA, and obviously the most business-friendly political party. The other one is the MK party, and we don't really know what their policies are, but I'm pretty sure it's not going to be business-friendly. And the third one is the EFF, and they don't have a policy. They're all over the place. The problem with the DA is that the DA, if they go into coalition with the ANC, that's probably going to lead to the end of the DA itself. I don't think the DA will go into a coalition with the, and of course it will lead to the end of this collaboration between some of the political parties at the moment. So I think the most likely scenario is for the ANC to form a coalition with the MK party, or perhaps the EFF. And that's why I say we've got a bad scenario, and that's another 5 years of the ANC with the smaller political parties, or a worse scenario, and that's another 5 years with the ANC and one of the bigger opposition parties, the MK party, or the EFF. Of course, there are many things. It's not that difficult to put policies in place that will be beneficial to the economy. And in a way, many of these things are being put in place, but it's not a policy change. It's happening because the state is simply collapsing. A good example is the post office. The private sector is just taking over the role of the post office. The same with Eskom. The private sector is taking over that because the state is just not there anymore, or in many cases, just not there anymore. In a way, that is a good thing. So in a way, we're privatizing much of that, but it's very costly if you have a state and an administration that keeps on preventing the right thing from happening. The right thing eventually happens, but it's a real battle to create state-proof organizations, to use a word of Dawie Roodt, to create state-proof organizations and to try to get away from the obstacles that the state put in the way of the private sector. There's so much energy in this economy. All we need to do is unleash it, and the ANC is not going to do that.
A question from Marius. Why does no one seem to prioritize local authorities?
Yeah, that's an excellent, Marius. That's an excellent question. The local authorities, of all the authorities, I would say the local authorities are probably the most important, because if you've got a business, your first port of call will be with the local authorities. They are supposed to give you water and electricity and a pavement and a road. And you're absolutely correct. The local authorities are not a priority. When you look at the budget today, everybody was listening to the budget of the Minister of Finance, and the budget is about national accounts. Of course, in the process, the local authorities and the SOEs are also mentioned, but it's about national accounts, and it should be about the local authorities. You're absolutely right. The local authorities should get much, much more priority. And one way of doing that is by giving the local authorities more autonomy. And that's exactly what's happening in the Western Cape, by the way. Cape Town is doing that. Cape Town is simply taking more responsibility and more autonomy. And that's one way of fixing the local authorities, and that's give them more power and take much of some of this power away from the national government.
There seems to be a lot of questions from individuals asking, what can I do as an average South African with a normal salary with all this information? Is it simply to wait and hope for the best?
No, you've got a normal individual. What can you do? Well, in the end, the buck stops with you. Remember, the 29th of May, there's a general election in South Africa. Please, people, go and vote. And what I advise people to do is go and read about the various political parties, read about their policies, read about their ideologies, what they stand for, what they're going to do, and make an informed decision. So decide who you want to be in government. That is your priority number one. The second, there are a couple of other things that you need to do as well. If you've got a job, keep your job. Make sure you're not going to lose your job. Make sure you are productive. If you want a wage increase, make sure that you increase your productivity with that as well. If you've got a business, make sure your business survives. Make sure that your business will be there tomorrow. That's your first priority, to have a good business and to have a profitable business. But from a financial point of view, make sure you diversify your portfolio. Make sure a substantial chunk of your assets are invested abroad, as an example. Call one of the efficient advisors and get one of the efficient advisors at Efficient Wealth to advise you on these kind of things. That's what we do, the economists here at the Efficient Group. But what you've just seen, we do analysis like what you've just seen, and we advise our asset managers and our financial advisors how to advise their clients in the process as well.
Just a fun comment from Derek saying, how will we charge electronic vehicles when we don't have enough electricity?
Derek, I can tell you, how can we charge electric vehicles? There is, in fact, and another example, I've just read about a private company that is setting up quite a number of these charging stations. It's not government doing it. It's the private sector, again, setting up all these private charging stations and making use of solar. So don't worry, the private sector will always come to the party and always come to the rescue.
There's a couple of questions, Fala, Michelle, and a couple of others asking if you can please explain, in your opinion, how you believe the proposed BRICS and BRICS relationships and potentially even the BRICS currency will affect our economy now and in the future.
The BRICS thing, I think the BRICS thing is something that blew over mostly. There were a number of countries that were invited to join BRICS. One of them was Argentina. And when the new president was elected a few months ago from Argentina, one of the first things he said was, no, I don't want to be part of BRICS. So I don't think BRICS is such an exclusive club. The Saudi Arabians, which I think will be an excellent member for BRICS, by the way, they also haven't made up their mind whether they want to join BRICS or not. And I think a couple of other ones as well. So I don't think BRICS is such a big thing. Additionally to that, there are two biggest members on BRICS, and that's India and China. They don't always see eye to eye. So there's already tension within the current existing members of BRICS. And then the last comment about BRICS, and that's a BRICS currency. A BRICS currency is unlikely to become a reality, and there are many reasons for that. One important reason is there simply isn't a deep capital market behind whatever going to be a BRICS currency. And if you ask the Chinese about the BRICS currency, they will always say, yes, it's going to be my currency, the renminbi. And the Indians going to say, no, anything but the renminbi. So no, I'm pretty sure we're not going to see a reserve currency, a BRICS reserve currency. But what is already happening is that the big BRICS countries are making use of certain payment systems to pay one another. So that's simply to pay for imports and exports, but it's not a reserve currency. The only currency that can potentially rival the US dollar as a reserve currency is the euro. And even the euro, the Europeans do not have a unified capital market behind. So the US dollar will rule supreme for quite a long time still.
We have some comments about the research that we did on the civil servants pay. Some people are disagreeing, saying that it might not necessarily be the nurses and the teachers that are paid too much, but the fat cats.
The fat cats. I have to agree. We need to look at things like, for example, the average civil servant in South Africa is overpaid. There's no doubt about that. Compared to the average South African, even if you look at certain, not all kind of occupations, but in many occupations, the average civil servant in South Africa is overpaid. It is also very true that the senior civil servants, the fat cats, are very much overpaid. And if you compare South Africa's civil servants to the rest of the world, we are also, on average, overpaid. There's another reason why I say we're overpaid. If you look at South Africa's quality of civil service, and you can measure that against various things, look, for example, the quality of education. I showed you some numbers. Look at the quality of policing. Look at the murder rate in South Africa. Look at, for example, the quality of our health services. Then you will see not only do we pay our civil servants more than the most and more than most South Africans, the quality is also significantly worse than most places in the world. It doesn't mean that there are not civil servants that are underpaid and overworked. There certainly are, but on average, that is certainly, without a doubt, not the case. What I would like to see is a professionalized civil service. I would like to see civil servants being paid more, much more than what they're getting now. But they must be much better qualified. They must get a much better quality service. And of course, the cost benefit, from a cost benefit point of view, it must make sense for the taxpayer in South Africa. And I think certainly what needs to happen, we have to get rid of the fat cats. There are far too many fat cats with black cars and blue lights driving around that are completely and totally overpaid and certainly not necessary in the civil service.
Yes.
And thank you to those civil servants that do a proper and a good job. There are many of you.
Good point. Brendan is asking, how badly will we be taxed once NHI is implemented, and how can we protect ourselves considering we've reached our tax limit?
That's interesting, is that I actually expected the Minister of Finance to mention something about the NHI. There's a question now about the NHI. I don't think the NHI is going to become a reality for many, many years. There are a number of reasons for that. One is it simply isn't money. There isn't money. It's probably going to cost us a couple of hundred of billions of rands in order to fund that. There just isn't money. Secondly, it's probably going to be illegal, because based on, and I'm not a legal expert, but there are certain included in the new legislation will be that you will be limited on where you can perform your services as a medical practitioner, as an example, and that is unconstitutional. So the moment the president signs that legislation, the next day he's going to be in court, and it will be bogged down in the courts for many, many years to come. And the third reason why I don't think it's going to become a reality for many years is that there's something good about having an inefficient government, and that is that they also cannot implement a bad idea. And the health services in South Africa is an excellent example of inefficiency. Well, what we need to do, we need to fix the health services, the public health services in South Africa, before we can even think of an NHI. The NHI is not going to happen. It's not going to happen for a long time. They're going to try to do that, and it's going to cost us money, but it's not going to become a reality for a long time.
A question that I think would be good to answer, Brian asking, what is the outlook for the local stock market?
The outlook for the local stock market, I must tell you, I'm getting more and more concerned. The local, fortunately, there are two issues here. The local stock market is determined, the valuation or the future of the local stock market is determined by two things. The one is the local economic performance, and that's really bad. The other one is international economic performance, because many of those companies are actually international companies. They do business, a lot of business international. And the global economy is doing not too badly. And many of these South African international companies are doing actually quite well. But more and more companies are leaving the JSE. The JSE, I think there's just over 300 companies listed on the JSE, and more companies are leaving the JSE. If I can choose, I will probably rather pick international companies to invest in. I could decide to invest in some South African companies, but it will be South African international companies. The JSE is a small stock, a small bourse, and they will continue to lose listings, because that's what's been happening the past couple of years.
I think this is a good question that you also enjoy. Can digital transformation, AI and the sort, play a role in overcoming our economic obstacles?
Digital transformation can play a role, without a doubt. And I think that is, without a doubt, a silver lining for South Africa. Digital transformation and technological changes allow the individual to do a lot of things without the support of the state. So people go on the internet, and I can trade internationally, I can work internationally, and I can do all sort of thinking internationally. I can simply do it on the internet, and I don't need a politician to give me a stamp or to give me a piece of paper or whatever. And that is what technological change is, what it does. It empowers the individual. And quite often it empowers the individual to such an extent that it doesn't matter where you are. As long as you've got a good internet connection, you can be anywhere in the world and you can still be part of the growing, advanced part of the global economy. And that certainly is something that I think is a silver lining is, and that in a way is making politicians less relevant, especially politicians like what we have in South Africa. So they're becoming less important, less relevant, because more and more economic activity is happening in the cloud or happening by more and more advanced forms of technology.
I'll just combine these two questions. Will Cape Town be able to continue succeeding in the future due to it being run by the DA? And then there's another comment about the DA seeming they're ignoring low-income segments area of the market. And they sing to the tune of their donors.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily a big DA fan, but I can tell you the DA, Cape Town is much better. In fact, DA municipalities as a rule are much better. Not all of them, as a rule are much better managed than most other municipalities in South Africa, especially under ANC. The Cape Town itself is exceptionally well managed. I don't think it's necessarily because it's the DA. I just think there's very good leadership in Cape Town. The comment that the DA is not interested in poorer areas, I think that is not correct, generally speaking. And I think the DA is trying to go out of their way, trying to get support from lower income people, because lower income people mostly support the ANC or some of the other political parties. They're trying to get support from those income categories. They're not very successful. It doesn't mean I like the DA necessarily. There are examples where the DA is just not doing a good job. And I've got some serious questions about the senior leadership in the DA as well. But Cape Town, without a doubt, is very, very well managed. And to make the comment to say the DA simply ignores poor areas, that simply is not true.
Then a question about the US presidency. Zander is asking, do you believe that a Biden US president or Democrat will benefit SA more than a Trump Republican presidency?
Biden is very close to the ANC. Biden, when he was still a senator, he's been in South Africa previously, and he's very close to the ANC. Biden, as long as Biden is president, as long as he can remember, I don't know if he can always remember everything, but I'm pretty sure that our relations with the United States will remain fairly good. Trump is a completely different kettle of fish. Donald Trump is going to get up one day and say, these guys are not playing ball, scratch them from AGOA, and off you go. That's the kind of guy that Trump is. He's certainly not as close to the ANC as Biden is currently. So a Trump presidency is probably going to be less good for South Africa.
There seems to be this general quick question about what is the chance for real political change? I like this comment that Anthony sent in. Is there someone or some party that can not simply band-aid our budget, but be a surgeon general and come up with a new deal like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore did? Is there a chance for real change like we saw there?
Yeah, and we're seeing that. We're seeing, Malay from Argentina is also trying to affect real change in Argentina. I hope he's going to be successful. Yes, I don't think it's going to happen in the next 5 years. I think we've got another 5 years of ANC misrule. But what is, I think, encouraging is that we're in a transition period. We're in a transition, and 5 years is not that long. Transition period where we're moving to something else. It can be compared to 30 years ago. That's something else. Exactly what it's going to look like, I'm not sure. It could be something better. And what we certainly need in South Africa, and I guess that is what your question is pointing to, we need a right of center political party with broader appeal in South Africa. We know there are a couple of smaller right of center political parties, the DA and a couple of other ones perhaps, but we need a right of center political party with broader appeal. That's one. And we need a champion for that. We need an individual that can take that center-right ideas forward and convince the population that it will be good for them to implement certain political changes that reduces the role of the state in the economy. We don't really have that. But I think we are in the beginning of a political transition, and hopefully, cometh the moment, cometh the man.
Mufaro is also asking a good question. With immigration being a big political issue now, even in South Africa, is there real monetary impact, and is there a plan for this?
Yeah, let me get something about immigration. I listened to a politician this afternoon, and this guy sounded real xenophobic. Immigration is not a bad thing in a country. There are a couple of rules, of course. It is always better to get the best quality of foreigners to come into South Africa than to get bad quality foreigners coming into South Africa and selling drugs, as an example. But overall, if you look at foreigners coming to South Africa, there are many studies done on this. If you look at the unemployment levels amongst foreigners, even illegal foreigners in South Africa, the unemployment levels are significantly lower than under South Africans. And there are many reasons for that. One is that they cannot get grants. They are basically unemployable because they are illegal and they start their own businesses. They haven't got a choice. And quite often those are individuals that are risk takers because they're taking risks. They're swimming through crocodile-infested rivers to get to South Africa. And that's what we need. We need risk takers. And quite often they are the foreigners and they're coming to South Africa. And they start businesses in South Africa. And they do not take jobs away from South Africans. They contribute to the economy. So foreigners, legal or illegal, as provided they don't do bad things like selling drugs and stuff like that, for example, probably contribute far more to the economy than what they take out of the economy.
I think it's a good question. Any tax deductions we can look forward to?
Any tax deductions? The short answer is no.
Then there was a question. Any view on property prices? I think that's more general question in terms of your outlook for South Africa, but then property prices.
Okay, property prices. I think that's the last question, Francois. Or do you have something, one or two more? Okay, on property prices, I think interest rates are going to come down. Usually, traditionally, interest rates is the strongest single driver behind property prices. And I do believe the Reserve Bank will start cutting interest rates by the middle of the year, and that can support property prices as well. There are some other factors that drive property prices as well. One is inflation. So if inflation starts accelerating, well, it doesn't look like it in the short term, but if inflation starts accelerating eventually, that will be supportive in nominal terms, at least, of property prices as well. But I just want to make the final comment. If you really want to invest in property, you have to live somewhere. So buy a property perhaps, but I'm not very keen on property as an investment. And there are various reasons for that, but I think that's for another evening. I just want to thank everybody for listening. Thank you very much for tuning in. It was really nice to talk to all of you. Again, take out your phone, take a picture of this QR code. You want to send me an email, you're more than welcome. And again, I want to thank my team, Francois. And thank you very much for everybody else, Shantae, Eunice, Wilhelmine sit in Zambia, can you believe that? Alay, Lazan, the yellow lot, and everybody else, everybody that I'm missing out on. I know there were a couple of editors working on this presentation. And I must tell all of you, this was absolutely amazing to see how this team worked together and put this amazing presentation together in a very, very short time. This was a lot of work. And thank you all so much for listening to me. I really appreciate that. Goeienaand, lekker aand vir almal.